Many. When you're in school, you just sort of take for granted, like, oh yeah, they're telling me this and this and this. It's not till years later that you realize you're just sort of repeating the same things you were taught. And I was really fortunate that I had sort of two ends of the spectrum when I was in school. So on one side, April Greiman was the head of the program, and April is like filled with energy and innovation and trying new things. And so she really instilled that, but also with a real love of fine typography. And then I also had Lou Danziger, who was my advisor, and Lou was really focused on concept and the big idea. So those two things I think really came together to help form who I am.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I am your host, David Block. And today I am honored to have with us the only two-term national president of AIGA and a distinguished leader in the design community, the Dean of Visual Art and Communication at ArtCenter College of Design, Sean Adams. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, David. It's really a pleasure to be here.
I'm so
looking forward to it all week long.
Excellent. I'm really looking forward to jumping in and exploring your career history, which is really the basis for this show. Is I like to go back as far back as I can and sort of talk about your influences and then move through your career. Nice, and so with that, my first question, going way back, I'd like to know, when did you first realize your passion for graphic design? What was it that sparked that interest for you?
It's such an interesting question, because you can go back to like when you're like 3 or 4 and you're kind of like obsessed about a piece of typography on something. Yeah. But I don't think I took it seriously until I got into high school. And when I was in high school, someone along the way had said, that Sean guy, he can kind of draw, which kind of is the operative word there. And so, somebody asked me, could you design the poster for the school musical, or could you do it for homecoming, or could you and so by the time I was ready to graduate, I think I was taking 2 periods of art just to get the work done, because there was so much graphic design that had to be. I think I did the city stationery. I mean, I was sort of like this little one-man shop. Yeah. And my parents and my grandparents had always presumed that I would sort of follow people's footsteps and do what other people in my family had done, which was mostly politics. So they were like, well, you go to Harvard Law, you become a senator. What's the problem? And I went to them and I said, I don't want to do that. I want to be a graphic designer. And you can imagine they were just sort of like, what can we do with you? And and after that, I don't think anyone bothered to figure out where I was going to school. I think at one point my mom said, you go to like Caltech or Cal Poly or something, right? Like really paying close attention to that. Right. But hey, you got to just go. It's your life. You got to go out and live it on your own.
Excellent. So, but you attended ArtCenter, right? Or not ArtCenter? You were at CalArts.
I went to CalArts. Yeah.
Yeah. CalArts.
Yeah. It's such an odd, funny reason too, because I have a stepsister and she's a graphic designer also, and we're the same age. And so when it was time to go to college, I did what everyone thought I was doing, which is I did my interview at Harvard and everything's great. But on the side, I had applied to CalArts because I knew my stepsister was applying to ArtCenter. So I was like, okay, you go to ArtCenter, I'll go to CalArts, So that was, I would love to say there was a giant strategy behind it, but it really was just, I don't want to go to school with you.
I see. Okay. Excellent. So I'm curious if you think back to those days of your time at CalArts, what were the most impactful design lessons that you came away with, and how did they shape your creative process?
Well, I mean, there's so many. When you're in school, you just sort of take for granted, like, oh yeah, they're telling me this and this and this. It's not till years later that you realize you're just sort of repeating the same things you were taught. And I was really fortunate that I had sort of two ends of the spectrum when I was in school. So on one side, April Greiman was the head of the program, and April is like filled with energy and innovation and trying new things. And so she really instilled that, but also with a real love of fine typography. And then I also had Lou Danziger, who was my advisor, and Lou was really focused on concept and the big idea. So those two things I think really came together to help form who I am. But it really sparked my love of typography. I mean, I really found like I I just wanted to do that the rest of my life, like just focus on type, and I think a lot of that does come from April, and people might look at her work now and say, oh, it's just all over the place, but it's not. It is so finely tuned and refined on a grid. So I think that was a big part of it was that sort of willingness to innovate.
I see. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. All right. And so in your early career, I'm assuming after CalArts, you were a designer with the New York Public Library.
Yeah,
right?
you've done your homework. Yeah, good for you.
So now for New York Public Library, I'd like to know if there were if you faced any design challenges that you could talk about during that time.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, when I was about to graduate from CalArts, I remember going to the head of the program at the time, who was Lorraine Wild, and I asked Lorraine, I think I'm supposed to get a job. Do I need a resume or something? And she pointed out that we'd had a visiting artist recently, and that visiting artist had gone to my type class and liked what she'd seen. So she'd gone back to New York and talked to a bunch of designers there and said, hey, there's this kid in LA. He's doing some interesting stuff. Right. So Lorraine said, basically, there's like 5 firms that want to interview you. And I hadn't even contacted them. So, I mean, that was incredibly lucky. Yeah. And and they were sort of the big firms. It was Triumph and Geismar and Vignelli and Pentagram. But one of them was the New York Public Library. And in the end, I decided to go with the library because I was going to be working, in the design office, but my projects were mine. Like, I didn't have an art director above me, which meant sink or swim, right? And that was challenging because you're so used to like, well, someone's going to tell me how to do this, right? And you kind of have to learn along the way. And then the library just ended up being this sort of incredible boot camp of rigorous typography and classical rules that I wasn't prepared for. I had, modernist typography, got that down. But someone says, design a classical book. And that was a steep climb, but it's so rewarding to actually do it. So that was a big challenge. And then I think I faced what a lot of designers face at a certain point. You've been out of school for a couple of years, you've been working, and you start feeling restless. Like, I'm not moving fast enough. I've got to move faster. And in retrospect, I wish I hadn't listened to that voice as much, because I probably would have stayed at the library longer because I loved that job so much. I mean, it was like, to this day, my favorite job ever. But I was so like, I got to keep moving. I got to keep rising. I got to keep rising. And I just wish I'd slowed down a little bit and just enjoyed, the amazing time I had there.
I hear you. I can absolutely relate to that sentiment. Now, going a little bit in a zigzag pattern, I think. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your time at AIGA. Mm-hmm. You were the Los Angeles president, and later you were the national president for 2 terms. Mm-hmm. You've undoubtedly influenced numerous initiatives. Could you possibly discuss 1 or 2 of the projects that were particularly transformative or had a significant impact on the design community?
First off, I have to say I am 1% of all of these. Like, I was the tiny portion of a much larger team, of the entire design community, forwarding a lot of these things. One of the first things that I really got involved in on a national scale was what we called back then in the early 1990s, the Equal Opportunity Initiative. And that's what we would call DEI now. Right. But it was basically trying to transform the design profession, which at that time was 89% white, and I think it was 70% male, to trying to diversify it more. Right. And that was a big initiative. And back then people were like, well, what's the problem? Why are you so worked up about this? Yeah. But I just saw like the profession couldn't survive if it didn't reflect the audience it was talking to. That if you just can't. You can't just be this isolated group telling everyone else what to do and what to think. So that was a big challenge, but AIJ picked it up and they just stuck with it. I mean, they worked on it to this day. That's, I think, number one on like what the mission is.
Mm-hmm.
So that meant a lot to me, and that was sort of my early time with AIJ. And then as president, my first term, I'd started to notice that the profession, and this was God, when the hell was that? 2006 or something like that. I can't remember when I was president, but
Okay.
what I noticed was that the design profession was kind of splintering. So you would talk to someone and they'd say, "Oh, I'm a motion designer," or "I'm a print designer," or "No, I only do visual interaction design." And I really thought it was important to make sure that we stopped defining ourselves by the media we worked in, but more as just we're designers. We tell a message in any media we have to. And breaking that down so it didn't start turning into these little niche groups that wouldn't talk to each other. And so that was a real, that was a challenge. But I mean, knock on wood, I think today proof is in the pudding that people don't say I'm just one thing. They're willing to just sort of say, yeah, I'm a designer. I can do anything. And then my second term, the AIJ had a building they owned in New York that were the headquarters, and they had sold the building. And there was a lot of public outcry, like, why did you do that? You should have kept it, whatever. And so they brought me back at that point, I think just to help knit the community back together again.
Right.
And that was tricky because you got friends on both sides that are very angry. But in the end, the decision had been made. Now we had to make it work. And I was, to this day, I'm sort of pleased with, I ended my second term with more money in the bank. AIJ had more money in the bank than ever in history, and it had the most members than ever in history. So awesome. I was like, hey, it's like the Eisenhower years, right? I kind of like got it all to like hold together.
That's great. Wow, that's fantastic. If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you. Moving on just a little bit, I have a question about your time with your agency, AdamsMorioka. Mm-hmm. Now, you're a co-founder of that agency, and I'm curious if you could talk about a project or two mm-hmm. that had substantial challenges with the initial concept that forced you to make a strategic pivot.
I mean, there's so many, right? Because it's like, as designers, we would probably be so much richer if we just did the same thing over and over again, like just make the same widget repeatedly. But unfortunately, we try to reinvent every single time and make every project better than the one before. So I would say that one of the first projects that really shifted the way that I was thinking was this ages me, but it was VH1, which was part of the MTV Networks. So VH1 had come to us and said, we need a new logo. And I'm like, great, logo job, start working on it, whatever. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized the logo wasn't the problem, that I could make a super cool logo, which in reality just had to be a 1, because that really kind of was what made sense. But the problem was actually more about their programming than it was about anything else. So, Paul Rand always said, a designer can make a good product great, but he can't make a bad product good. And I couldn't fix the product. And so I had to go to them, and I remember sitting down with the president of the network and saying, yeah, the programming is kind of awful. Like, it's like Gallagher specials and Carrot Top. Like, I don't know what it is. Like, so what if we focused it? And at the time I sort of figured they could own American popular music. MTV was all about new music. They could own sort of the history of popular music. So I said, well, let's just make it about music. Drop all the other stuff. Just focus on that. And, and I had some good champions working there too. So they moved in that direction. And it really signified to me that my job as a designer was not just to come in and be sort of like a type maid, like just sort of clean up the type. Right. My job was to help them move ahead as a business. And in that instance, it meant telling them something that was uncomfortable, but was the reality. And, fortunately, Yes, we know we have a problem. That's a great idea. Let's do that.
Right.
So I think that was the one that really switched my thinking to my job is not to make pretty. My job is to solve problems, and not just a problem like, oh, how do I get people to come to this event? But how are you making money? How are you attracting visitors? Whatever the issue is, what's the big problem that we have to solve?
Mhm.
And just digging into that deeper, like thinking sort of on a bigger scale than just singular transactional projects.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because otherwise you go in and you do the job and then you're done. You leave, right? But if you can get in there and really start identifying, hey, look, you're leaving money on the table with advertising revenue for these reasons. Or, when I was working with Nickelodeon, it was like, you don't have the tween market. How do we get into that? Or, any of those. And so that was a real challenge. And I have one other story, if you don't mind, but
Yeah, go
I
for
was
it.
working on Disney Clubhouse, which was part of Disney Regional Entertainment.
Mhm.
And the creative director there was someone who I've grown to love as a good friend. But she, at the time, I remember we came in with our solution, and I'd done this very clever logo that was like a house, but it had a little Disney D as a smokestack.
Right.
And she just said, "Can you make it work harder?" And I remember leaving the meeting like, "What the hell does that mean? Like, I don't know what she's saying. Like, what do you mean work harder?" And I really was forced to sit down and make it work harder.
Wow.
And in the end, because she pushed me, she was like, "No, that's not enough. We got to go deeper." I was able to come up with a really incredible variable system that had what we called a magic knot hole that characters could pop through, and just sort of address this sort of like chaotic making that kids do in a new way. And I would have never gotten there if Samantha Fleming hadn't said, "Make it work harder." Like, so frustrating, but so right.
Right. Oh my gosh. So now you also have worked with the Academy of Motion Arts Science. Let me say that again. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences.
Yeah,
that's a mouthful. And it must have been a unique intersection of design and cinematic history with that project.
Yeah, that was a labor of love, and not in any way bad way, but it meant so much to me. It was such an amazing project. The Academy had never had logos. You think, of course they must have. They've been around, for almost 100 years, but they had never had one singular logo. So it was one of those classics, like every business card was different. Everyone had a different variation on it. And some people were like, "Don't use the statue." Other people were like, "Yes, you must use." So it was sort of all over the place. So a lot of it was just sort of like, how do we collate it all and just make something that is clear and versatile. And so, in the end, it's one of those situations where the obvious answer is sometimes the very best answer. And most people won't go to obvious because they think, well, it can't be that obvious. When in fact it should be. And in that instance, it was the statuette. It has to be. It's one of the most recognizable symbols in the world. So yes, it's the statuette. One of my friends, who at that point I think was 90, Doyle Young, who was a great letterform designer. And Doyle had his wish for his entire career had been to work with the Academy, and he never had been asked to do that. So I asked him to redraw the statuette. So Doyle did that, and it was the last job he did before he passed away. Wow. And so that I love that I was able to sort of like, and to this day they're still using Doyle's statuette, which every time I see it I feel good. That's and wonderful. Then the reason that they had come to us was, strangely enough, 20 years earlier, Saul Bass had recommended us. Oh. And Saul died many, many years ago. So someone along the way remembered, hey, didn't Saul Bass recommend some people? And so they can, so the word mark that I created for the Academy was based on Saul's title sequence in Spartacus, because it was this beautiful extended craw modern. And I was like, yeah, we got to get some Saul in here. It's just, so it was sort of those two together were like this kind of incredible homage to people that I really, really idolized. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wow. What a great story. And now I'm curious. Okay. moving on just a little bit, you've actually written a few books. I have a few of them. Here's one, your latest one, and we will talk a little bit more about that. I've got a question about that one. I've also got your Designer's Dictionary of Color. I've got the Color Design Workbook.
That's so cool. I love that.
Books. And but I do have a question about your the Designer's Dictionary of Type. I'm curious. You went deeply into various typefaces and their impacts. And I'm curious how, first of all, how did you decide which typefaces to include? And second part of that is, what was the most surprising historical insight that you discovered during your research?
Good questions. These are hard questions. I chose the typefaces based on the ones I like. That was part of it, because there are a lot of typefaces out there. Yeah. But I knew I really wanted to stick with sort of a classical history of type. Like, we start off with Garamond, we sort of work our way through Caslon and Baskerville and into sans serifs, and represent every kind of a family in typography to just sort of round it out. And the book was really written for designers, you know, so you're starting out designer, you want some tips on some good typefaces, but also I wanted to write it for clients, because clients are often like, well, who cares what typeface it is? It doesn't mean anything. So I wanted to give something a designer could give to their client and say, there's a reason why you make these choices. You know, these aren't just strange arbitrary choices. Right. So that was sort of the impetus to do that. And there's one typeface in there that I love, but it really has no reason to be in there, which is the typeface Graphic by Eric Spiekerman. I love Graphic. And I know I have enough sans serifs already, but it was just one of those where, like, it's my book, I'm putting it in there. Like, like, I like it a lot. And not a lot of logic behind it, but I like it. And it's a good typeface. So that was sort of like how I chose, you know, each one to go in there. I see. And you know, what was interesting and what sort of really bubbled up to the top was, and it's something that I don't think I even included in the book, because I think we decided we get into trouble. But when I was doing research on specific typefaces, you know, I have my sources, of course. You know, there's some great, you know, Encyclopedia of Typefaces is fantastic. There's some other great books on type. Right. But when I would look for things online, like, oh, well, what do they say about Caslon online? You would find things that you would never unsee. Like, I would find variations of Caslon that were egregious to the extreme. Oh, right. And I started to figure out what was going on, is that people would scan Caslon and then live trace it in Illustrator and then upload it as a font. So it was just these horribly redrawn versions. And that was shocking to me, because I was like, well, I know there's bad cuts of things out there, but I didn't expect it was like this sort of rampant miscarriage of justice that was going on out there. Right. And so today, when I talk to the first term students at ArtCenter in graphic design, I often go in and I'll show them an example of, like, here's a bold Caslon I got online. Here's Caslon, the correct Caslon. See the curves, how bad that is? Like, so they can start to learn to actually look at it and not just trust the name, because anyone can scan something and give it a name and upload it. So that was sort of the little hidden door I didn't know about.
I see. Excellent. Okay, that is an interesting story. I will keep my eye out for fake Caslon.
Fake. Oh my God, they all have them. And you find, then when you find you have the real one and you compare it to that, and you're like, what happened? Like, this isn't even close.
I have two walls in my classroom that I've got my font. I called it my font walls. I've got 150 different fonts all over the place, and I think I've got Caslon up there, and I'm sure it's the right one. I think it is.
Right. I'm sure it is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So my next question is on the in the same vein. I'm curious, are there any type trends or innovations that you're excited about, or any type trends that you can talk about?
I mean, one of the things that blows me away, I have no idea how to do it, and it's really one of those, like, you know, science fiction tropes of, like, if the technology is far enough advanced, it seems like magic. To me, is the students that are working on generative typography and variable typography is magic. I don't know how. I know they do it with code. I can but when I see what they've done, the idea of taking something that is, theoretically you stretch it and it's going to become heinous, but somehow you've designed it so it actually maintains its elegance in motion and on the screen, stretching or condensing or changing scale, and built with code is miraculous to me. It just blows me away. We used to have the rule, I think all graphic designers were, never stretch type. It's not rubber. And, right. And so that was the first time a student showed me a project they were working on. I was like, oh my God. Oh yeah, that's it. That's the doorway to hell. But, then I really looked at it, I'm like, that actually held together really beautifully. So I think that idea of thinking about typography as its primary usage is on the screen. Yes, there is print, but we look at type on the screen all the time. So why should type be static? It doesn't make any sense. It's like, right. It can move. It should move. It should respond. So that innovation, that exploration, I just find incredibly exciting. That's the stuff I see, and really, it's magic. I got to take the class, obviously, because I'm making it much specialer than it probably is.
That actually kind of reminds me, when you talk about stretched type and like that, reminds me of Paula Scher's work on oh boy, I can't remember the name, the poster work that she has done.
Or like the stuff she did with the public. Yeah, I think there's a couple of series that Paula did that was like beautiful stretch typography, but I mean, it's well done. Right. It's not like, because you know what it's like. Somebody's like, hey, I just wish that were a little bit more condensed, and they smash it, and you just end up with terrible counters and bars. And I'm like, no, find the right typeface. Don't just type,
I struggle with that on a daily basis with my students all the time. Yeah.
It just because you can do it doesn't mean you should, it's like,
right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay, now moving on to your role at ArtCenter, as the Dean of ArtCenter. I'm curious if you could talk about a major initiative that you introduced that that made an impact on student learning, and what the challenges that you faced with that.
I always feel so corny when I talk about like the things that I'm working on, because I always think it makes me sound like I just walk through life like with rose-colored glasses, thinking like everything's swell. But one of the things, and it carries through from my work with AIGA back in the 90s, it's DEIAB. It's just the idea that we still aren't there in the profession, that it is still heavily weighted towards white designers. It's still, well, actually, I think there's 60% women, but they only have 11% of leadership positions. So that means it's our job as educators to help change that. And that may not just be, okay, we have to attract a more diverse student body. It's a matter of having the students start to look beyond the norm. So rather than looking at, I'm just going to look at Western European graphic design, like Swiss type is the only type in the world. That's it. To start to recognize that there's other ways of thinking, there's other ways of making that may come from a completely different culture and a different place. Mm-hmm. We have one class that I was really worried about when we decided to launch it. I just thought, this is going to be great, or it's going to go down in flames. Right. And it was it's a communication design class, and Cheryl Miller Holmes, who's one of the foremost Black graphic design historians in the country, is the co-teacher with Tracy Schiffman. And they gave a project to the students, which is basically design a publication based on your experience as other, whatever that is. Right. Like, it doesn't have to be, oh, it's because I'm Asian, or it can be, I'm just a freak, right? What right. is the other that you are aware of, that sometimes makes you feel unlike everyone else in the room, and then explore that and bring that into the work. And we're doing that with basically freshmen. And so I was really concerned, like, are we hammering them with stuff that's conceptually way too advanced? But from the first term we did that, they started coming out with amazing work. I mean, stuff that like brings you to tears. And I was like, wow, they were not just responding to it, but it opened up these gates for them to understand that they were not just in service of commerce, that as designers, they had not just the right, but the duty to express their own personal vision and to sort of reveal their own truth in life, that it wasn't just, I'm doing some math and building some grids, but to just explore that other idea of like, who are you and why do you do this? It meant a lot. And there's some people I think that are on the faculty that are like, that's corny, who cares? It doesn't matter. But I know the students that do that walk away. And the thing I love is after that class, I'll ask, well, how'd that go? What did you learn? And almost always the biggest thing they learn is I have confidence in myself. I know I can do anything now. Like, that's pretty good. If you can get someone to that place where it's like, I bared my soul and it worked, that's amazing to me. So I think that's one of the initiatives that I'm proud of. And we're not done. I mean, it's still an ongoing battle of how do we change concepts of beauty? If every time someone has a persona and every persona is the same blonde white woman who's 35 years old and #1 on the Google search, how do you expand that? Like, no, maybe that's not the appropriate definition of what should be, the consumer. Right. So sort of exploring that and pushing those things a little deeper, just so that the students are always learning. I mean, that's the best part about being a designer is you get thrown in these projects and you have to learn about entirely different cultures and ways of thinking. And so it's an ongoing challenge. It's not going to go away, but I don't think I can lighten up on it. I think I have to kind of keep hitting it, like I'm going to make mistakes and I'm going to say the wrong thing, but you got to plow forward, torpedoes be damned.
Right. We'll make it there. We will make it there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It'll happen. It'll
happen whether we want it to or not. It's going to happen. It's just, are we steering it or is it just happening around us? Right. And I think we can, as designers, as sort of the protectors or the authors of popular culture, we can have a hand in the way that we perceive others in life.
Right. Absolutely. So in your view, what would be the most critical trends in graphic design and that educators like myself should incorporate into our curriculum to prepare our students for a successful career in the industry?
You asked such good questions, and I thought they'd all just be easy ones. But,
I could come up with a lot easier questions.
Some really ones like, do you like blue? Things like that, So the things what I hear from, I mean, in addition to obviously, understanding broader and diverse audiences than yourself, that's a given. But what I hear a lot from the recruiters, we have a grad show at the end of every term. And it's this big event at the convention center, and we also do one online. And about 3,000 people from different companies come and try to recruit students for work, for jobs. So I'm always asking them, what are we not giving you? What do you want more of? And they always come back with like, okay, well, first we want someone who understands craft. That craft is important, and it is. I mean, this is a skill. This is not. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if you cannot execute flawlessly, forget it. I mean, craft is wheels on a car. You expect it, right? So sort of flawless typography, beautiful craft, a sense of perfectionism. That's what they sort of expect as, basics. But what they're asking for more, and what we keep trying to imbue more and more of, is the ability to present that often as designers, I think a lot of us are introverts, and it's sort of, you get up in front of an audience, you're like, oh God, I'm so nervous, Right. But that ability to sell an idea, if you're working in any organization or for a design firm, you're going to have to sell an idea at some point, is something that they really need. And then collaboration, which of course you get so little of when you're in school, because every project is sort of like, oh, I'm working on my poster project, or I'm working on this project.
Right.
But they're all like, we just want people that can collaborate, because that's all we do. And people get out of school and they're so used to working alone that working in teams starts getting really emotionally wrought.
Right.
So a lot of it's been like, how can we introduce more collaboration? How can we introduce exercises that give people more confidence standing in front of other people and talking? And that's, I would say those. I mean, if someone walked in the door and is like, hey, I already got this speaking in front of people down, they're way ahead of the game. They're going to do great.
Yeah, absolutely right there with you. Yeah, absolutely.
I still think what we ought to do, and nobody takes me up on this, which obviously means I have very little power as a dean.
Yes.
But I think we should force the graduating students to do Oklahoma, like do a production of Oklahoma. If you do that, you can get it from Present a Logo easy, like once you've done that.
I love that idea. That's fantastic.
Yeah, but they're like, no.
We need to collaborate. My students, your students, we just get on stage. Let's do a production. Let's do
it. Yeah, it'd be fun, but
so okay, moving back to your books, I'd actually like to talk about how design makes us think and feel and do things. What a great name. I love that.
Thanks.
So you explore the influence of design on emotions, from nostalgia to anger. And I'd like to know if you could share how your design strategy might change when you're targeting specific emotions.
Well, one thing that one of the reasons I wrote the book in the first place was I'd gotten into the situation so many times with designers where they would present their work. I did this, this, and this. The reasons they did those things were completely clear to me. Like, yes, that is the correct choice to get the audience response that you're looking for. But when asked to explain why that was what they did, they couldn't. They would just be like, well, because red makes me happy, and I'm like, that's just not enough. And I could see how quickly they would get shot down by clients because they actually had nothing to back up the reasons for their aesthetic choices.
Yeah.
They were making the right choices because I think as designers we're really good at that. But then articulating, well, why is the audience going to respond this way? And not just from my subjective point of view, but from actual, science, strangely enough, Yeah. So that was a lot of it, was really like, what drives us? Like, why do bright colors make me happy? I don't know. I had to look it up. I have to do some research, and or why do all of the protest posters have a similar look? Because I don't think it's a style. I don't think it's like, hey, is there a book on style while I'm making my protest poster? There's like reasons for these things, and then to be able to dig into it and sort of deconstruct, all of the other initial elements. My hope was it would just give designers more ammunition, that they'd be able to walk into a room, present something and say, no, I did it for these reasons, because this is why people respond to it this way. That there's clear logic.
Right.
One of my friends, Michael Vanderbilt, has a great saying, which is when he works with clients, he tells them 80% of what I give you is going to be rational and logical. 20% is me, and it's not rational or logical, and you're going to have to accept that.
Right.
And I love that because it's like, that's kind of true. Like,
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So how has your perspective after writing this book, How Design Makes Us Think, how has your perspective on design changed? And are there specific areas within design that you've come to view differently or prioritize more as a result?
I've come to understand that it's important to be aware of the emotional response that you want to elicit.
Right.
That we have a vague sense sometimes of like, oh, I just like people to like it. There's more. like if I can target that a little bit more closely, I want someone to be angry, or I want them to feel nostalgic or have memories, or I want, what is that thing I'm targeting? Then I can actually use some of those tools to reach that I'm not just sort of kind of guessing and sort of, oh, it kind of feels like this. The issue of anger was the one that really surprised me, and I didn't have anger in the book initially. And my editor, who's amazing, said you can't just have nice emotions. You're going to have to put some in there that are unpleasant. and I'm like, oh, I got to research that. So so getting anger in there really was interesting, like to understand why the way we make things, when we want to convey an idea that this is important, this is serious, this demands action, what are those visual cues that tell us that? How consistent those were in almost everything, that we've just come to know, okay, if I see sort of, silkscreen bad typography in one color on cheap material, that's urgent, right? So we kind of know that, like, nobody had time to make it. Someone had to get their stuff together and pull it together and print the thing out. So understanding that was important. And then something else that kind of came along with that was sort of this idea of this anti-design work that I think I include in the book, and some of the Fillmore work, some Fillmore posters from San Francisco in the 60s. And it was always like, well, why is it like that? Like, why is it kind of crazy and psychedelic and handmade and all that kind of stuff? And then digging into it and recognizing, okay, what was happening in culture at the time? What was society doing? You're talking to an audience that is rejecting everything corporate and they're rejecting the establishment. So using Helvetica would be completely wrong, right? So the way to talk to that group and say, I am talking to you and I'm speaking your language, is it's entirely handmade. It is like in no way bowing down to, as they said back then, Madison Avenue, that they weren't selling toothpaste, that it was all about harmony. But recognizing that was a response to the culture at the time, and a specific aesthetic choice away from what we would consider good design.
I see. Excellent. Well, I will absolutely have a link to your book, to all of your books in the description, in the video description. And we have made it all the way to the very end of the show.
That was fun.
I know, right? It went so fast. I just want to say thank you once again for agreeing to be here and letting us explore your work history. And I have one final question, though.
Yeah, sure thing.
What strategies would you recommend for young designers to maintain their creative vision when faced with conflicting client demands or market pressures?
So meaning, like, I come in with a solution and my client's like, I don't like it, I want red.
Right.
Okay. To be able to back up all of that stuff with as much logic as possible, even though you and I know it's not always logical, but you got to backtrack a little bit. Yeah. So if I go in, if I'm working on a project, the first thing I'm ever going to do with a client is basically work it all out in writing. Like, write down, like, well, what do you want to communicate? Let's agree on what we're going to communicate. Write down those 7 words, 5 words, whatever it is. Oh, I want to communicate that I'm, irreverent, or I'm, fun, or whatever. Give me a list of those things so I know what I'm trying to communicate. Right. So then when I come back and I show that red cover and they say, I don't like red. Well, then I can say, well, one of the words here is action and the other is energy. Red conveys those things. Are those the wrong words? And they'll typically be like, oh, actually, what I like isn't that important. It's more important than what the communication is. Right. So being able to kind of get to the bottom of what are they asking for, and then why are you delivering the things you're delivering, with a reason that, well, you said you wanted to talk about this, or you said this was the priority message. That's what we're doing. somebody came to me the other day, and her dad had asked her to design something. Her dad has a manufacturing company, and her dad had asked her to design like an ad for the company. Bad idea. Don't do it ever for family. But she agreed, and she came back and she said, yeah, he hated it. And she did this beautiful project. It was beautiful. And I said, what was the problem? And she said, well, he said, why is there white space? Why are we wasting space? We should put something there. And so we went over it again. I was like, okay, you need to explain to him. He said the priority was this message. If you surround that with other stuff, you won't see that message. You know, that's the reason you made that choice. You need to articulate that to him. So she went back and shared, and then he was like, oh, that makes sense. Okay, I got it. So it wasn't just, oh, it looks better. It was like, no, you said you want this message to be important. If it's always shouting, none of it's important. Right. So always falling back on like, what are the words that they told you? And how are you responding to those words? As opposed to, oh, I felt like doing something with balloons. You know, like, well, why? What's the reason? What, you know, and a little trick I've used with clients for a long time is, I'm bad at remembering sometimes. And so I'll always say, remember when you said we should use red? That was a great idea.
Put it back in their court. Exactly.
And they're always like, yeah, that was a good idea.
That's wonderful. That's actually fantastic advice. And on that note, I just have to say thank you once again. And it's been wonderful. Yeah, I wish we could just continue this conversation. Well,
anytime. It's good to take a break from my Excel documents.
I hear you. I hear you. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again.
Thank you, David.